from Bohemia, but he practiced all his life in Vienna, and he was the doyen of cardiac pathologists. And it is said over his career, he undertook many thousands of cardiac autopsies, and he produced a wonderful book on the anatomy of septal deficiencies. And here is one of the pictures from his book. In fact, this particular one doesn't have a septal deficiency. And what he's done is he's shown us the short axis of the base of the heart viewed from the apical aspect. And this, of course, is exactly how echocardiographers now show you the short axis view of the heart. And what you can see to your left hand is that the arterial trunk arising from the right-sided ventricle is interposed between the atrioventricular valve and the septum, whereas to your right hand, you see a dilated left-sided ventricular chamber, which is giving rise to the aorta. And this is the first example we know of what we now call congenitally corrected transposition. And now we also know that the features that produce congenital correction of the transposition is the fact that not only are the ventricular arterial connections discordant, and that of course now is the definition of transposition, but combined with that, we have discordant connections across the atrioventricular junctions. And the two discordances cancel each other out, and that is why transposition is congenitally corrected. It can be found with either usual or mirror imaged atrial arrangement. Today, in fact, I'm only going to discuss the entity in the setting of usual arrangement, but it excludes other lesions which I'm going to call close cousins. And those other lesions are the finding of discordant atrioventricular connections with other ventricular arterial connections. I'll show you a couple of examples of those at the end, and those are very close cousins. But since we don't have transposition, then strictly we should not be calling these lesions congenitally corrected transposition, although they do have discordant atrioventricular connections. We should exclude those hearts in which there is double inlet left ventricle, in which the incomplete right ventricle is left-sided. Again, a close cousin, but not congenitally corrected transposition, because double inlet is not discordant atrioventricular connections. Isomerism, when we have both appendages of the same morphology, is oftentimes associated with left-handed ventricular topology. And that, again, is a close cousin to congenitally corrected transposition, but it is different. It is a close cousin, but it is not congenitally corrected, as is the case when we have absence of one or other of the atrioventricular connections. So what we are discussing today are these specific connections that produce congenital correction of the transposed arterial trunks. So if we look at the flow of blood through the heart, in the drawing I'm showing you at the moment, the atrial chambers are usually arranged. Morphologically right atrium is on the right, but the blood from the morphologically right atrium is pumped into the right-sided morphologically left ventricle. There are discordant atrioventricular connections. The circulation is corrected, however, because the morphologically left ventricle, in consequence of the transposition, the discordant ventricular arterial connections, pumps the blood into the pulmonary trunk, so the blood goes the appropriate way round. It's therefore returned, in this instance, to the left-sided, morphologically left atrium, usual atrial arrangement, and then the left atrium, because of the discordant atrioventricular connections, pumps the blood into the left-sided, morphologically right ventricle. And then the right ventricle sends the blood out into the aorta. And this, of course, is the Achilles heel of the circulation in the genetically corrected transposition. Although the blood is going the right way round, it's being pumped into the systemic circulation by the morphologically right ventricle. And this is the arrangement that we see in usual atrial arrangement. So if you remember when we discussed regular transposition, we could have exactly the same thing in the setting of mirror-imaged atrial arrangement. And this is also the case with congenitally corrected transposition. So when the atrial chambers are mirror-imaged, the morphologically right atrium is now left-sided. But because of the discordant atrioventricular connections, now it pumps its blood into the left-sided, morphologically left ventricle. So the left ventricle is where we expect it to be. And then because of the discordant ventricular arterial connections, the left ventricle sends the blood to the lungs, the trunk. The blood comes back to the morphologically left atrium, which is now right-sided, and then goes into the right-sided morphologically right ventricle, again the Achilles heel, because it is the right ventricle that has to pump the systemic circulation. So this obviously is the mirror-imaged arrangement. The atrial chambers are mirror-imaged. Because of the discordant atrioventricular connections, however, the ventricles are in their anticipated location. And if we think of ventricular topology, when we have mirror-imaged atrial arrangement, we have right-handed ventricular topology, whereas when we have usual atrial arrangement, we have left-handed ventricular topology. So these are the makeups that produce congenitally corrected transposition. And I can show you that arrangement in these cuts that I took through a heart from the Pittsburgh archive. I've had these cuts in my collection for quite some time, and they show very nicely what is going on when you have double discordance. So this is the most inferior cut through the heart, and you can recognize the morphologically right atrium. You can't, in fact, see the pectinate muscles, but what you can see is that the systemic veins are coming into the morphologically right atrium. And then you can see that the chamber on the right side is finely trabeculated, and it receives an atrioventricular valve without any septal connections. This is the morphologically left ventricle. We can recognize on the left side that we have the morphologically left atrium because there is a smooth vestibule. You can just see the narrow neck of the tubular left atrial appendage. And then we can also see that the left-sided ventricle is coarsely trabeculated, telling us it is the morphologically right ventricle. If we then take a cut a little more anteriorly through the heart, then you see the discordant ventricular arterial connection on the right side. We see again the morphologically left ventricle, the fine crisscrossing apical trabeculations, the fact that the atrioventricular valve has no septal connections, and we see that it is pumping its blood into the bifurcating arterial trunk, which is the pulmonary trunk. And then, if we look at the most anterior cut through the heart, we see the left-sided ventricular arterial connection. There we see the morphologically right ventricle. Very nicely, we see the coarseness of its apical trabeculations, and it is sending its blood into the left-sided aorta. So we have discordant atrioventricular connections combined with discordant ventricular arterial connections. Transposition is congenitally corrected, but here in the setting of intact septal structures. And there is no reason why individuals with this arrangement should not live a full life. And there are examples in the literature of congenitally corrected transposition being found as an event in autopsies carried out in individuals in their 9th decade. So on occasion, when the septal structures are intact, individuals can lead a full life. But usually that is not the case. So let's look at the features that, despite the correctness of the circulatory flow, conspire against this combination permitting a full and blemishless life. So let me show you another heart that has intact septal structures. But this time I've opened the chambers in pathological fashion. So you're looking here at the right-sided chambers. There you see the morphologically right atrium. You can see the oval fossa posteriorly on the septal surface. You can see the entrance of the systemic veins. And very nicely there, you see that the right atrium is expelling its blood through a morphologically mitral valve. And we know that the valves go with the ventricles. So beneath the mitral valve, we find the morphologically left ventricle. If I then fold back the mitral valve so that you can see the ventricular outflow tract very beautifully now, you see the morphologically left ventricle with its fine crisscrossing apical trabeculations, smooth septal surface. There again, we see the mitral valve, and we see the pulmonary trunk arising from the morphologically left ventricle. And as we expect in the morphologically left ventricle, there is fibrous continuity in the roof of the chamber between the arterial valve and the atrioventricular valve, in this instance, between the pulmonary valve and the mitral valve. We can also see another feature that was very characteristic at the stage at which because there is this left ventricle in front of the pulmonary trunk. Because the pulmonary trunk arising from the left ventricle is deeply wedged between the mitral valve and the septum, leaving us this anterior diverticulum, which, as I say, was one of the characteristic features seen when congenitally corrected transposition was diagnosed on the basis of angiography. Nowadays, of course, we have much better ways of recognizing the discordant atrioventricular and discordant ventriculo-arterial connections. But let's look at the other side of this heart in which the septal structures are again intact. And now you can see the Achilles heel of the circulation. So here is the left atrium, which receives the pulmonary veins. It has the tubular left atrial appendage arising from it, and very nicely there on the septal surface of the atrium, you can see the horns of the flap valve of the oval fossa. And it is expelling its blood into the morphologically right ventricle. But here is the problem. The tricuspid valve, usually in the setting of congenitally corrected transposition, is itself malformed. Here, in fact, we can see multiple short cords that are attaching the septal leaflet to the septum, and there's a degree of dysplasia of this leaflet. And during life, this was regurgitant. You can see the fibroelastosis on the wall of not only the morphologically right ventricle, also the left atrium. And this is the reason why this patient did not survive. It is the fact that the morphologically right ventricle is pumping the blood into the systemic circulation that is the Achilles heel of the circulation in this setting. So we can see that there is an infundibulum supporting the aortic root. You can very nicely there see the coronary arteries arising from the aortic root. We're going to come back and discuss that in a little more depth. But here we see the morphologically right ventricle with its coarse trabeculations, but the chamber is dilated. and it has this fibroelastotic lining telling us that the morphologically right ventricle in the majority of cases is not capable of pumping the blood into the systemic circulation for a full lifetime. So to repeat again, this is the Achilles heel of the corrected circulatory pattern. Now, this is what the heart looks like when before you open it, and typically in congenitally corrected transposition in the setting of usual atrial arrangement, discordant atrioventricular, discordant ventricular arterial connections, the aorta is anterior and right-sided. But is L transposition the same as congenitally corrected transposition? In many instances, the aorta is left-sided and anterior, as I've just shown you. But we cannot always use L transposition as being synonymous with what is genetically corrected transposition with mirror-imaged atrial arrangement. The segmental pattern in Van Praaghian nomenclature is IDD. We do not have an L loop. We do not have a left transposition IDD is congenital because those segmental combinations mean that there is discordance at both the atrioventricular and the ventricular arterial transport. Anterior left-sided aorta, but that is not congenitally and left-handed ventricular topology not congenitally. I think we have a problem with the transmission. Hopefully Sasha can sort this out, but we seem to be having problems in transmitting at the moment. But here we're going, okay. The problems in the circulatory arrangement. And in congenitally corrected transposition, we have a well-known triad of associated malformations. In the majority of cases, significant proportion, there is pulmonary stenosis. And again, in the majority of cases, there are anomalies of the morphologically tricuspid valve. And even in the setting of intact septal structures, as again I've shown you already, it is the anomalies of the morphologically tricuspid valve that tend to be the Achilles heel of the arrangement. So how do we analyze the ventricular septal defect? We do it just as we would for the ventricular septal defect in the isolated situation or in regular transposition. So we know that the majority of cases are going to be perimembranous. And as I'm going to show you very shortly, the phenotypic feature of the perimembranous defects is mitral to tricuspid fibrous continuity. We can have muscular defects anywhere within the septum, but they are rare. I'm going to show you an inlet defect. We can also rarely have apical defects. We can have outlet defects. Also rare, but present on occasion, defects that are juxta-arterial. And again, their phenotypic feature is the presence of fibrous continuity between the leaflets of the pulmonary and the aortic valves. I don't have a juxta-arterial defect to show you, but I can show you examples of perimembranous muscular defects. So this is what the perimembranous defect looks like, but this is what it looks like. And there you see the phenotypic feature, the leaflet of the pulmonary valve. And so that makes the defect perimembranous. But because we have discordant atrioventricular connections, as I'm defect. And this is perhaps the key feature of congenitally corrected transposition. Now, at first sight, that defect that I've shown you seemed to be opening between the ventricular inlets. But that was because I was showing it to you as seen from the morphologically left ventricle, which in uvulate arrangement, as we discussed, is right-sided. And in fact, when we assess the defects as we have agreed we should do from the morphologically right ventricular aspect, then we find that the majority of these defects open to the right ventricular outlet or else are confluent. I have to admit I was unaware of that fact until it was brought to my attention by this group who studied a large series of hearts from the archive, initially at Marie-Lanelong in Paris, under the direction of Lucille Hoyot. Lucille is now working at Enfants Malades Necker, and in this elegant paper, it was Lucille and her colleagues who pointed out that we should be analyzing the ventricular septal defect from the stance of the morphologically right ventricle, and when we look at it from the right ventricle, we can find perimembranous defects opening predominantly to the outlet, but also confluent or opening to the inlet. So this is an important paper describing the features of congenitally corrected transposition. As I say, the defects can also be muscular. This is one of the very nice pictures taken by Diane Spicer. As you know, I regularly now use Diane's excellent images. We're looking at this muscular defect, which is opening to the inlet of the morphologically left ventricle. There it is. We're looking at it behind the mitral valve. And because of the abnormal location of the conduction axis will run anterocephalad to the muscular inlet defect. But as you've just seen, in congenitally corrected transposition, even when the defect is perimembranous, the conduction axis will be anterocephalad. I'm going to show you shortly why that is the case. So the second of the associated malformations is pulmonary stenosis. And here again, as with regular transposition, I pointed out that anything that in the heart with concordant ventricular arterial connections that produces aortic stenosis will produce pulmonary stenosis when the ventricular arterial connections are discordant. So again, we might find the stenosis at valvar level. We oftentimes find a fibrous shelf, and that has an important relationship to the conduction axis, or we can find tissue tags. Now here's a nice picture of a tissue tag. You're looking at the outflow tract, the pulmonary trunk from the right-sided morphologically left ventricle. You will recognize mitral valve coming into this right-sided morphologically left ventricle. And there is the tissue tag. It is blowing into the subpulmonary outflow tract because, in consequence of the discordant atrioventricular connections, it is the left-sided morphologically right ventricle that is the high-pressure ventricle, and that is blowing the tissue tag and producing subpulmonary obstruction. This is the problematic lesion, however. This is the shelf that is producing a diaphragm directly beneath the pulmonary valve. In this particular heart, there was a coexisting perimembranous ventricular septal defect. But look at the relationship of the atrioventricular conduction axis to this subpulmonary fibrous shelf. It is running through the fibrous shelf, and that is why you cannot, in this instance, resect the fibrous shelf so as to relieve the pulmonary stenosis. So let's look at the third of the associated lesions that produce problems with what otherwise would be a normal circulatory pattern. And this is abnormalities of the morphologically tricuspid valve. And these are present in 9/10 or more of individuals with this combination. And the commonest is the ebstenoid malformation. As I'm going to show you, it is not pure Ebstein's malformation, but it has the features of Ebstein's malformation. And part and parcel, the features of the Ebstein's malformation are dysplasia of the valvar leaflets, but as in hearts with concordant atrioventricular connections, the leaflets in the setting of congenitally corrected transposition can be dysplastic even when there is no displacement of the hinge of the septal leaflet. The other big problem is straddling and overriding of the morphologically tricuspid valve, and that in fact underscores a spectrum which has at its endpoint double inlet left ventricle. What I'm going to show you, we then have a similar spectrum when there is overriding and straddling of the mitral valve, and that ends up with double inlet right ventricle. But here is the main problem, the ebstenoid malformation. I'm showing you the left-sided atrioventricular junction in a heart, again, from congenitally corrected transposition with usual atrial arrangement. And you can see very nicely the level of the atrioventricular junction. And what we see is the characteristic feature of Ebstein's malformation. There is rotational displacement of the hinge of the septal leaflet of the tricuspid valve away from the atrioventricular junction. But unlike the situation when we have Ebstein's malformation in the setting of concordant atrioventricular connections, it is very unusual to have thinning and so-called atrialization, anatomic atrialization of the inlet of the morphologically right ventricle. So I've only seen one or two hearts over my career in which there is also marked thinning of this inlet part of the morphologically right ventricle. In this particular instance, despite this marked rotational displacement of the hinge of the septal leaflet, the myocardium of the inlet is equal in thickness to the myocardium of the apical trabecular component. And it's also unusual to find the abnormal tethering of the anterosuperior leaflet of the valve that is so typical of Ebstein's malformation when found with concordant atrioventricular connections. So it certainly has similarities with Ebstein's malformation, but I think it is reasonable to describe this as the ebstenoid malformation rather than pure Ebstein's malformation. Here is the second problem, straddling and overriding of the leaflets of the tricuspid valve. And there you see the tendinous cords that are going across the crest of the ventricular septum to be attached within the right-sided morphologically left ventricle. And the problem here is hypoplasia of this morphologically right ventricle. We've already discussed the fact that it is problems of the right ventricle that are the Achilles heel of the circulation, but when the morphologically right ventricle is additionally hypoplastic, as it is in the setting of straddling and overriding of the tricuspid valve, that compounds the problems on the systemic circulation. Then we can also have straddling and overriding of the mitral valve. So here you see the situation in which the straddling mitral valve is mostly connected into the right-sided morphologically left ventricle in this heart that has usual atrial arrangement. So the right atrium is connecting into the morphologically left ventricle with straddling overriding of the morphologically mitral valve. But the end point of this spectrum, as you see here, gives us an incomplete left ventricle that is tucked away in the hip pocket of the ventricular mass. And when, as in this heart, we have usual atrial arrangement, the incomplete left ventricle is posterior and right-sided. It is in the right hip pocket of the ventricular mass, making the right ventricle the dominant ventricle. There you see one or two tendinous cords supported within the right-sided incomplete left ventricle, but the larger part of the right-sided atrioventricular valve, all of the left-sided atrioventricular valve are supported within the dominant right ventricle, giving us double inlet right ventricle with usual atrial arrangement and with left-handed ventricular topology. And it is the ventricular topology that determines the arrangement of the coronary arteries, because the coronary arteries follow their ventricles. There can be variations in the coronary arteries, so we need to know their sinusal origin, just as we do for hearts with regular transposition. We need to know their epicardial distribution. And so we analyze them just as we would if we were dealing with regular transposition. So we position ourselves as a little mannequin in the non-adjacent sinus of the aorta. Here I'm showing you an example where the aorta is anterior and left-sided. And then we describe the adjacent sinuses according to the way we see them looking towards the pulmonary trunk. And then the sinus to our left hand is sinus number, I think I might have got this the wrong way around, but our left-handed sinus gives rise to the morphologically left coronary artery. Now the right-handed sinus, sinus number 1, gives rise to the morphologically right coronary artery. So here we have the convenient situation as in the normal heart, where the left-handed sinus gives rise to the left coronary artery, the right-handed sinus gives rise to the right coronary artery. And the variations are not nearly as great in congenitally corrected transposition as they are in regular transposition. In fact, the most usual variation is a solitary coronary artery. But let's turn to perhaps the most important feature, the atrioventricular conduction axis. And the abnormalities of the atrioventricular conduction axis reflect both the ventricular topology, but combined with septal alignment. So when with usual atrial arrangement we have left-handed ventricular topology, we anticipate that there is going to be septal malalignment. I'm going to show you why that is the case very shortly. And it is the septal malalignment that underscores the abnormality in the location of the atrioventricular conduction axis. When, however, we have right-handed topology, and remember, right-handed ventricular topology goes along with mirror-imaged atrial arrangement. Van Praaghian nomenclature, this is transposition IDD. there is better alignment in the hearts that have been studied histologically. And this is because, as was pointed out by my good friend and colleague, Reza Hossainpour, now working in Spain. Reza conducted a very elegant study when he was working at the Brompton Hospital, and he showed that in the majority of cases with congenitally corrected transposition with mirror-imaged arrangement that had been studied histologically, there was either pulmonary obstruction, pulmonary atresia, or pulmonary stenosis. And because of that, there was better alignment between the atrial septum and the ventricular septum. And Reza pointed out that it was because of this septal alignment that there tended to be a normal conduction axis. But there can be an abnormal conduction axis also in the setting of mirror-imaged atrial arrangement. So the real key is the alignment between the atrial septum and the ventricular septum. And we can see the typical malalignment very nicely in this particular heart. This is one of the first hearts I studied in any detail with congenitally corrected transposition. This stems all the way back from when I worked on this topic in Amsterdam in 1974. I was working with Anton Becker. This is one of the very nice hearts from an adult that was in Anton's archive at the old Wilhelmina Gasthuis. So we're looking up at the base of the morphologically left ventricle. Morphologically left ventricle, of course, is right-sided, because this particular heart comes from an individual who had usual atrial arrangement. So that is the morphologically right atrium. And there below it, we see the morphologically left ventricle. And what I've emphasized to you already is that when the septal structures are intact, as they are in this heart, in fact, you can see there an aneurysm of the interventricular component of the member of the septum. So when the septal structures are intact, the pulmonary valve is deeply wedged between the mitral valve and the septal surface of the morphologically left ventricle. And it is this malalignment gap. There you see the plane of the atrial septum. It is markedly malaligned relative to the plane of the ventricular septum. And it is this malalignment gap that means that the bundle branches carried on the crest of the muscular ventricular septum are no longer able to reach the regular atrioventricular node, which is carried at the apex of the triangular cock. So instead, we know that in congenitally corrected transposition, there is an anomalous atrioventricular node. And this is located just beneath the mouth of the right atrial appendage. And then a long non-branching bundle joins this anterior atrioventricular node with the atrioventricular conduction axis. And then, as you see, the conduction axis runs anterocephalad relative to the outflow tract of the morphologically left ventricle. And then when there is a ventricular septal defect, as I'm showing you in this heart, the conduction axis runs anterocephalad relative to both the pulmonary route and the ventricular septal defect when we look at it from the right side. So this is the view as the surgeon might see it, working through the morphologically right atrium. It's going to be opening the mitral valve so as to get at the interventricular communication if working through the right atrium. Key point, the connecting node is no longer in the triangle cock. Instead, it is anterolateral beneath the mouth of the atrial appendage, and the conduction axis, as you would see here, if you opened the right ventricle, so at the morphologically left ventricle, the conduction axis is running anterocephalad relative to the ventricular septal defect. As I've shown you, this holds good for perimembranous defects. It also holds good for muscular inlet defects. So let me finish by mentioning one or two other points about congenitally corrected transposition, because oftentimes the heart itself is abnormally located. And this can be due either because of tilting of the ventricular mass, and that produces the arrangement known as supero-inferior ventricles, or because the ventricular mass is rotated. And it is rotation of the ventricular mass that produces that arrangement that is often now known as the crisscross heart. As my other good friend and colleague Shi-Jun Yu, the radiologist, now working in Toronto, and Shi-Jun was initially working in Seoul in South Korea, Shi-Jun pointed out to me that the essence of the crisscross heart was in fact twisted atrioventricular connections. And that is the key to understanding, because even though the ventricles are twisted, that does not change the ventricular topology. So how do we get these arrangements that change the orientation of the ventricular mass? If we tilt the ventricular mass, then this is what happens. The apex is tilted to the right. This will typically produce a right-sided ventricular mass. And then, as you see, the morphologically left ventricle will be superior to the left-sided morphologically right ventricle. More importantly, what happens in the crisscross arrangement? Now, if we have the regular congenitally corrected transposition with usual atrial arrangement, discordant atrioventricular connections, discordant ventricular arterial connections, then we anticipate that the aorta is going to be anterior and left-sided, as I'm showing you in this drawing. We know that in usual atrial arrangement, there is left-handed ventricular topology. So again, in Van Praaghian terminology, this is transposition SLL. So what happens when we rotate the ventricular mass? This is what happens. We shift the aorta from being anterior and left-sided to being anterior and right-sided. And that also produces twisting of the atrioventricular connections. And the morphologically right ventricle adopts a much more anterior position, and it becomes relatively right-sided relative to the morphologically left ventricle that now is posteriorly located. But the key point, the twisting, which produces the aorta now in right-sided location, so in Van Praaghian terminology, this is now SLD, it does not change the ventricular topology. And this would no longer be L transposition. It could, if you wish, be L loop transposition, but it would not correctly be described as L transposition. If we are going to describe this in Van Praaghian terminology, we should describe it as transposition SLD. So just a few words about the close cousins. Discordant atrioventricular connections can exist with other ventricular arterial connections, isomeric appendages, or with univentricular connections. I'm only going to show you the arrangement with other ventricular arterial connections because here there is still discordant atrioventricular connections. So here is a heart that I'm showing you the right side. You're looking here at the morphologically left ventricle. You can recognize the mitral valve, smooth septal surface. But arising from the morphologically left ventricle is the aorta. In fact, when I first saw this heart, which comes from the archive at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, I mistook this arterial trunk for the pulmonary trunk. But when we look carefully, we see that the arterial trunk is giving rise to the morphologically left coronary artery, and it is the aorta. It also has an infundibulum supporting the leaflets of the aortic valve. So here we have concordant ventricular arterial connections with parallel arterial trunks. And so because we have discordant atrioventricular connections with concordant ventricular arterial connections, we have the hemodynamic pattern of regular transposition. Note that there is still fibrous continuity posterior-inferiorly between the mitral and tricuspid valves. We have a perimembranous defect, but because we have the discordant atrioventricular connections, the conduction axis will still be anterocephalad. So now we're looking at the other side of the heart, morphologically right ventricle, now giving rise to the pulmonary trunk, which arises side by side relative to the aorta, and then extends into the mediastinum in parallel fashion. Concordant ventricular arterial connections, discordant atrioventricular connections with parallel arterial trunks. The hemodynamic flow patterns of transposition, despite the fact that the ventricular arterial connections are concordant. Note again an infundibulum supporting the pulmonary trunk, and you see that in this instance also, the perimembranous defect opens to the outlet of the morphologically right ventricle. And here is one of the other ventricular arterial connections that can coexist with discordant atrioventricular connections. I'm showing you the left-sided morphologically right ventricle is giving rise to both the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Double outlet right ventricle with discordant atrioventricular connections. And note here we have another anomaly, straddling overriding of the mitral valve, and then yet a third anomaly, an ebstenoid malformation of the morphologically tricuspid valve. So all of the associated lesions that you find with congenitally corrected transposition are also to be anticipated in their close cousins when we have different ventriculo-arterial connections. Again, this beautiful picture by courtesy of Diane Spicer. So what have I told you today? Congenitally corrected transposition depends on the recognition of the abnormal connections. And if we're going to do that, we're going to make the appropriate diagnosis. First, we have to determine the morphology of the segments. What is the atrial arrangement? What is the ventricular topology? What is going on at arterial level? And then we have to work out how the components of these segments are joined together. We should not infer one feature on the basis of another, and that is why L transposition is not a good name for congenitally corrected transposition unless we are sure the L transposition is part and parcel of discordant atrioventricular, discordant ventricular arterial connections. And then, although potentially these connections produce a normal circulation, those associated malformations can distort the hemodynamics, and it is that typically which brings these individuals to your attention, and it is that that requires the accurate diagnosis. So as I started off, I will finish. It is sequential segmental analysis that is the triumph